It's a pleasure to address this event hosted by the Global Council for Science and Environment and to speak to you, students, deans, representatives from the government, the private sector, and the non-governmental organizations. In short, the very people who have the power to generate science and turn it into policies that protect people and our planet. I want to thank you, including obviously the Council's Board of Directors, for that commitment. My thanks also to the Council for its role in the Advisory Committee for UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook for Cities for the past year. Your scientific advice for this forthcoming publication has been a huge help because we rely on science. Science tells us what we need to know in order to shift policies. And so, dear colleagues, science is the bedrock of environmental action. Without it, we would be unable to identify the sources and the solutions to the problems that beset our planet. And in these extraordinary times, we are facing many problems, unfortunately. Right now, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused so much misery and so much disruption to our lives, and that is, of course, front and center. This zoonotic disease has highlighted many of the fault lines in our societies. For one, it has shown us that we have to rethink our relationship with nature, as our destruction of wild spaces is implicated in the emergence of such illnesses that jump from animals to humans. COVID-19 has also highlighted the income inequalities, with the rich growing richer and the poor and marginalized growing poorer during this economic slowdown. And it has highlighted the environmental inequalities facing minority communities, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who have shown to be more likely to catch and die from COVID-19. Yet, as bad as the situation is right now, things could get a lot worse. Because even as we seek to overcome this terrible pandemic, we do so with the knowledge that we, humanity, face three planetary crises: the climate crisis, the biodiversity and nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. Here's what science tells us about each of these crises. Let me start with the climate crisis. As I record this message, 2020 is set to be one of the hottest year on records. We have just lived through the hottest decade since records began. The evidence of the impacts of global warming is all around us: in forest fires, storms, droughts, inundations, floods, glacier melts. What more do we need? By mid-November, 30 named storms, 13 of them hurricanes, had brewed in the Atlantic, making 2020 the most active hurricane season so far. Right now, 2 billion people live in a situation of water stress, and by 2030, we expect and project that water scarcity could displace tens of millions of people. Too much water will cause a similar issue. One study suggested that 13 million Americans could be forced inland by rising sea levels just this century. This is that I want to talk about, the biodiversity and nature crisis, because nature is declining at rates unprecedented in human history. Today, around 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction. In North America alone, 30% of birds have disappeared in the last 50 years. Across the globe, humans have altered 75% of the terrestrial land surface and 66% of the marine areas. But nature is much more than a tree here or an animal there that we lose. As we degrade our ecosystems, we chip away at the very foundations of what makes life on this planet possible. That ecosystem that provides us the food, the water, the temperature regulation, economic growth, the roof over our heads, the clothes we wear, that is what nature gives us, just to name a few, but very essential services that nature provides. So that's a second crisis that we are facing. And the third crisis that I want to talk about is the pollution and waste crisis, that toxic trail of our economic growth, that pollution and waste that we produce every year, because every year pollution causes the premature death of millions of people in the world. Around 1/3 of all rivers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia suffer from severe pathogenic pollution. We throw away 50 million tons of e-waste a year, roughly equal to the weight of all commercial airlines ever made. And take just one item of plastic waste generated by the global pandemic. We need 89 million plastic medical wastes each month. No prizes for guessing where this waste goes or does not go when we're done using it. So none of these facts are disputed, save, well, maybe from vested political or economic interests. But we have acted strong enough on science, have we? Well, we say no. Let's look for a moment at the Paris Agreement as a case in point. It's been 5 years since the agreement on this landmark deal to limit global warming on this century well below 2 degrees and to pursue 1.5 degrees was struck. UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, through its annual emissions gap report, tracks how commitments are stacking up towards this goal. The latest edition, released in December of 2020, found that 2019 emissions hit a new high. And of course, yes, the pandemic-linked economic slowdown has caused a dip in 2020 carbon dioxide emissions, but that makes a negligible difference to long-term temperatures. Because, as I like to say, the proverbial carbon dioxide bathtub was already full, and stopping the tap for a second or two didn't make the bathtub go empty. We are still heading for at least 3 degrees of temperature rise by the end of this century, and to get back on track for a 2-degree world, we need to cut 1/3 of emissions by 2030. For 1.5 degrees, we need to halve them. Similarly, the UNEP Production Gap Report, which was produced early December, meanwhile found that the world needs to decrease fossil fuel production by around 6% year on year till 2030 if we are to have a chance of hitting the 1.5 degrees target. Instead, what we are seeing is that the current projection of fossil fuels averages an average of 2% increase every year. A post-pandemic green recovery where we use the stimulus funding wisely towards making these shifts towards a greener future has the potential to cut emissions by 25% by 2030. But only if we do the right thing, only if we make these investments and the stimulus packages with clear green strings attached. And so far, we've had little signs of governments doing enough to take advantage of this, hopefully, once-in-a-generation massive injection of public funds, our funds, into the economy. Instead, for example, we've seen some $230 billion of COVID-19 measures go to backing fossil fuels and only $150 billion to clean energy. So we have a long way to go, and to be frank, we are still at the stage where commitments are piling up without action. This applies to each of the 3 crises and every international agreement, from Sustainable Development Goals to the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity to the Paris Agreement. The age of promises must now turn into an era of action. So what do we have to do to get there? Well, one thing we need to do is to reinforce science so that science can make that real difference over the next decade. Science holds its promise. It is the ultimate tool to build peace when it's used to deliver policies that protect both people and planet. We at UNEP seek to deliver science that can strengthen the consensus on public global policy making, identify solutions, and guide actions for environmental sustainability. We do this through our medium-term strategy, which guides our efforts to help member states put the right science-based policies in place. This strategy is based on the need for systemic, integrated and transformative solutions to the 3 planetary crises. But we can and must do better, because science is only useful if it's in the right hands and if it's understood by as many people as possible. So we need to make it more open, more accessible to people, and that means digitizing scientific knowledge and democratizing availability, explaining it in ways that people understand so that more people can take it and use it and make it theirs. For example, when we speak about climate change, we know that 2/3 of all emissions happen within private households. But many people feel that they have no say and no impact on climate change. Yet if they understood the very footprint that their lifestyle has, they might just make some shifts. So people need to understand that the impact of their actions can have positively or negatively on the planet, and then they can take their share of the responsibility. Without the strong science that travels into homes, into households, into workplaces, we can't influence unsustainable consumption and production patterns. We can't turn that into sustainable choices that underpin the solution to the 3 crises that I mentioned. So science needs to reach out to more diverse sections of society, to opinions and experiences, and make it relevant to people around the world. And as the world has been woken up to issues of racism, of sexism, and of privilege, it's important that science of today understands and be quite explicit about that bias that science invariably carries with it as it tackles realities that many communities face. And it's important that science can reach into those communities by voices that carry authenticity. So part of the ask is to finding a balance between place-based, localized science and a global outlook. And I congratulate you for showing up on your commitment to this balance through changing your name from National Council to Global Council. That's what we need to have that global view whilst being local in our understanding of application. Because while the situation that I have described is dire, we also know that with stronger science and the associated action, we can get there. And now with engagement from the US, we can see that we are stretching even further as we project what now needs to get done. It is true, our actions have been too slow, but transformative action is now possible. And we've seen across the world that global commitments have been made to reduce emissions. We've seen that renewable energy has become more affordable. We've seen that demand for fossil fuel has shrunk. We've seen businesses lean in on factoring in climate and the environment in their investment decisions. And now we expect to see a renewed effort from the US towards multilateral commitments, both at the national and at the global level. And that is great news. President-elect Joe Biden has said that climate change is an existential threat and should be treated with the same importance as any other key US policy agenda. If the incoming US administration makes good on its word, then 2/3 of the world's economy will have made a commitment towards net zero by 2050, which is vital to get us closer to the global goal of 1.5. As the UN Secretary General has pointed out, we cannot achieve the climate target without the US. Just as the European Union has used its access to markets as an incentive for other nations to act on climate change, the US can also provide leadership and impetus to global climate action. It can provide financing to poorer countries for renewable energy alternatives and decarbonization. By doing so, it can support good governance and climate resilience, which can help avoid national upheavals and insecurity. And at home, the US can commit to decarbonizing the economy and to phasing out coal power plants and bring in renewable sources. Again, science will need to be at the heart of such efforts. Science is all there. Now is the time to tap into its potential and to translate what we know into policies that can make real change. This is part of the Global Council for Science and Environment's mission, to bridge the gap between the potential of science and its ability to inform decisions making and bringing about policy change. In this moment of renewed multilateralism in the US and across the world, in this moment 5 years after the Paris Agreement, in this moment when we are building back after COVID-19, in this moment where we are globally addressing inequality, racism and sexism, in this moment we must all work to bridge that gap between science and policy and action on a global level to enhance science-based policy making and science-based policy diplomacy for long-term solutions to the three planetary crises: the crisis of climate, the crisis of biodiversity and nature, and the crisis of pollution and waste. Science matters. Science must speak. Science must travel. Science must guide our best intentions, from multilateralism to changing consumer behaviors to building a more equal and just society. This is the ask that I have, and I have no doubt that together it is within reach. Thank you. I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of this important event. Thank you so much.